SECfans.com, Week 13, Clemson versus South Carolina. This is a game we cover every year. I think this is 3 years in a row, Josh, that we've done this one. It's a big rivalry, so we're going to talk about it. Clemson fans, remember, we're pretty objective, and we're going to point that out here in a minute. We're going to show you why you might have not thought we were objective, but it's proven out over the last couple of years to be the case. South Carolina fans, you know the drill. If you haven't yet already, please subscribe. Either way, please let us know in the comments what you think the score is going to be, what this game is going to look like. Let us know. Josh, I told you earlier in the week, we talked about this a little bit in the live show, and you gave me complete hell about it. I said, I wouldn't be surprised. Am I crazy to think that South Carolina might give Clemson a game this year? Last year they didn't, and we talked last year where South Carolina had this thing where they had the potential to score far outside the bounds of what their yardage performance looked like. So yards per play, total yards, not great. Still managed to put up like 35 on NC State, and they did that a few times last year. They've done that a little bit again this year, especially with the Missouri game. But what is interesting to me is we've talked about how Clemson has had a really bad schedule this year, and it's not their fault. We're going to stress this every time we talk about Clemson. It's not. You can be an elite team and have a bunch of crappy teams on your schedule. The ACC is not great this year, objectively, and we can talk about it again in the comments. Y'all tried to get us with the Boston College preview, and it's objectively true. This is not bashing the ACC. It's just a down year, and it's historically down. Objective metrics show that. We're not trashing your conference. We both weren't super high on Boston College's chances to beat Clemson, and we weren't high on Syracuse's chances to beat Notre Dame. We think that this year they just haven't had a lot of challenges, which is, we talked about we just finished talking about Ohio State and Michigan. And I said, okay, Penn State or Michigan hasn't seen a quarterback like Haskins, hasn't seen an offense like this all year, so should they be worried? Well, South Carolina is probably a better team than everyone that Clemson has beaten except for Texas A&M. That was a really close loss for South Carolina, but I don't think they're as good as them. So is there an opportunity? Let's just go ahead and clear the air here. Is there an opportunity that South Carolina could give the Tigers a better game than people are expecting? Because I think they're going into this weekend thinking Clemson has dominated everybody 70-0 recently, and now they're playing South Carolina, who's not having a great year, 6-4 right now. It's going to be blowout city. Can I say not so fast and not be crazy?
I will give you credit for the fact that this game might be closer than some people would expect, and the reason for that is it's really due to the difficulty in gauging what Clemson's done relative to the rest of the conference versus what South Carolina's been able to do in the SEC. It's the disparity between different conferences and models. Clemson has destroyed the ACC to an almost unprecedented level. We don't really know how that translates to what South Carolina's been able to do against SEC teams. We're not here to sit and just thrash the ACC. We will note, as we talked about in the live video, the ACC is a distant fifth in Power 5 conferences. If you were to rank the SEC and ACC teams, there's a guy, P-Dog, that put out a really good chart that took the average of all the major metrics, S&P, FPI, FEI, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Alabama would be number one. Clemson would be number two if you combined the ACC and the SEC. And then after Alabama and Clemson, it's SEC's number 2 through 10. South Carolina ends up squeaking in ahead of Miami, who's the second highest rated ACC team of that pack. The problem with that is it just kind of screws all the statistics to hell. Now, our model is not going to be terribly favorable to South Carolina. I'm going to throw that out there to start with. But one, I think South Carolina is a pretty darn good team. Two, we don't know what pretty darn good team is. And I say pretty darn good in terms of they're a solid team. What that really means relative to the competition that Clemson's faced. I do think Clemson's a better team. I do think Clemson's probably going to win this game. I don't think it's crazy to think that this game could be closer than expected because there's so little correlation between ACC and SEC. And I'm not even trying to get into the idea of, Clemson's opponents are all crap. Look, Clemson has destroyed their schedule, but we really don't know exactly what that means in the same way that Alabama annihilated their early schedule and they at least looked mortal when they played LSU and Mississippi State. Does Clemson look mortal against South Carolina? I think that's kind of the question.
And there's a nuance here in that it could be entirely true that this is the second best team, because I honestly think South Carolina would beat Syracuse. That this is the second best team Clemson has faced all year. Let's say they haven't played anybody as good as South Carolina.
Okay, outside A&M.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I'm saying for argument's sake, let's say, because that was a 26-23 game, right? So let's say for argument's sake, South Carolina is better than A&M, which head-to-head shows that they're not. But for argument's sake, South Carolina could be the best team Clemson has played all year, but Clemson could still blow them out. There's a nuance there in that just because you haven't played any good teams doesn't mean you wouldn't drill a good team if you played them. So first, I don't think they're the best team they played all year. I think they're the second best. Second, I still think they might be able to blow out a team that's even good that would have been on their schedule. That's my thought on it. What do you think?
I think it's fair. And to your point, before people get upset, 'cause scheduling we have found this year is the touchiest subject for everybody. Clemson's played a few good teams, even a few really good teams. I think Syracuse is a solid team. Not sure if Boston College is or is not a solid team. We saw that from last week, but A&M is a pretty good team, and we were really high on them, especially early in the year. They've fallen off late, but they handled A&M. They went through. They handled Syracuse in a close game. It is concerning that two teams that I think personally, the two teams on their schedule that I think are pretty good would be Syracuse and A&M. They weren't able to win those by sizable margins. They were losing the Syracuse game before Trevor Lawrence went out, which I think is a point a lot of people miss, which was in the second quarter. I think they still would have pulled ahead, and if Lawrence had been in the game, they would have won that game fairly comfortably. But it's not like they just struggled because Lawrence went out. They were already losing that game at that point. And to your point with A&M in that comparison, I mean, South Carolina lost to A&M 26-23. And A&M lost to Clemson 28-26. So A&M had a real similar game against both teams. I mean, very similar game. They came up short against Clemson. They pulled it out against South Carolina. But you're looking at essentially a very similar game. I think that's an interesting data point. But all that said, I still hedge to the fact that in the past several weeks, I didn't think Clemson was an elite, super untouchable team in the first half of the season. I didn't. I don't think that was even unfounded. The past several weeks, they've played at a very different level, especially the offensive consistency on both sides of the ball has been there, and the dominance has been the defense has been completely dominant. So I do think they've been playing at a different level since then.
Yeah, and I think people discount the A&M game for Clemson, and I don't think it's fair because at Kyle Field at night with a team that's still theoretically in the championship hunt because they hadn't lost a game yet, it was in week 2, is a different team than the A&M that LSU is going to get this weekend, I think. So, and to some extent, Alabama's not getting enough credit for what they did against A&M because A&M has a lot of talent on that team. They just haven't really put it together this year. Okay, so I think, to me, the Boston College game is, of all the games on Clemson's schedule, the Boston College game is the one that concerns me the most if I'm a Clemson fan because they're without their starting quarterback. They're not a great team to begin with. They just lost to Florida State. 27-7 is such a meh kind of outing against. I know it was a night game. It was on the road. A lot of fun. I'd like to see more there. The one that impressed me was the Duke game that followed it right up. And not so much the 35 because Duke I think they had 4 defensive starters out and 2 got hurt in this game. But the 6 is pretty impressive because Duke scored on a lot of people. And even early in the year, I think they beat Northwestern 21-7. Northwestern plays good defense. So to me, I wonder if there's some parallels there with Duke and South Carolina in terms of like not having the horses on defense to fully keep a team at bay like Clemson for 4 quarters, where if some things go their way early and they can score and get in a groove early, they might be able to stay in this game, but they're going to need a little luck or a little help, because it's just going to feel like, even this Duke game, when you watch this game, it really felt like Duke was just barely keeping their head above water. Every drive that they kept Clemson down, they were barely keeping their head above water, and finally the dam broke. I could see a similar game with South Carolina where they're up for the game. They've got a little bit of uniqueness on offense enough to keep Clemson, on their heels early, and then adjustments happen in second half. The floodgates kind of open. Could you feel this game going that way, or am I not seeing it the way I should?
I think it's probably a fair point. So Duke moved the ball a little bit real early in the game, and then they started getting hit after hit on Daniel Jones, and I don't even say he got rattled. His timing got thrown off, and you could see that game kind of spiral away from Duke because that Cutcliffe offense is one. It's a really good offensive system that Cutcliffe runs, and he is
with a good quarterback.
With a good quarterback, and he is a QB whisperer, and they find ways. We've been really critical of Auburn this year because, as we talk about a lot, their offense is not designed to get a guy open. Their offense is designed to run the ball until you overcommit to the run, and then they hit you with motion, and you overcommit to the motions and jet sweeps, and then they hit the wide open guy when you blow coverage. Duke is designed about using route concepts, high-low concepts and stuff like that to try to get a guy open where your coverage just has conflicts. None of that really matters if you're pressing the quarterback, because then he doesn't have time to make his reads, or even when he makes his reads, he has to throw the ball before the guy's in the spot he needs to be able to complete the pass. And that's what Clemson was able to do in that game. Pro-style offenses work the way Cutcliffe's offense works. It's about creating a mismatch in the secondary or a conflict or putting a guy in a bad situation due to a combination of routes, and then with timing, throwing the ball with accuracy to a spot where the guy, the defender, will not be able to cover. That is pretty dependent upon protecting the quarterback, because if you don't have the time to throw when the ball needs to be thrown, or the ability to step in the pocket and make the throw with accuracy, it all breaks down. Clemson's defensive front is exceptionally good, and they just don't allow teams to operate that at a high level. That's a real concern, because one thing we've seen from South Carolina under Will Muschamp is not particularly creative with finding some way to generate offense outside the traditional scheme. Jake Bentley is used as a traditional pocket passer. I think they're going to be willing to let it fly a lot in this game in a way that teams, including Duke, were not able to. But I still, like you said, I don't know that they've got the horses. And this is really, the Duke game is one of those examples why I think Clemson's turned the corner. I will say they shut down Boston College. It was a mad game, but Boston College didn't have any offense. I didn't.
Well, they're back at quarterback though.
Yeah, but I was about to say, well, I know, but AJ Dillon did come back from injury and he couldn't do anything whatsoever. But the flip side that I was trying to get to is, even when the starting quarterback came out, Boston College turned around and lost to Florida State. So it's fair to say that Boston College. It's tough to say how good they really are, but I do think Duke was pretty good, at least offensively. I don't think they're defensively were ever going to really stay with Clemson. And then that's kind of where the defenses are. The issue, the other side of the ball is how well is South Carolina going to deal with Clemson's offense?
Well, and before we get into that, I do want to get into South Carolina. I wonder if, even in a loss, 31-35 to Florida, the 35 is bad, and that scares me a little bit if I'm a Carolina fan. The 35 to a pretty, let's be honest, pedestrian Florida offense, the 35 is bad. But the 31 I like a lot. Being this South Carolina team and this South Carolina offense for a while now hasn't been the type of offense that could score 31 on the type of defense that Florida is this year. Florida's not a great football team, and that's why in total, losing to Florida 35-31, especially when you got up on them, jumped on them so heavy, and they're not the type of team built to come back. That's why I'm not super high on South Carolina right now. But just looking at their offense, 31 on Florida, 37 on Mizzou, they had a struggle game against Kentucky for sure, but this offense to me seems a lot more comfortable. I don't know if it's getting Deebo Samuel back. I don't know if it's kind of going more to AJ Turner instead of Rico Dowdle. Something is different this year, has a different feel that tells me at least offensively they won't be coming out of the blocks as a zero like they were last year against Clemson. Does that give you a little hope if you're a South Carolina fan?
It does. And the thing that often gives me hope is if you see something change. In South Carolina, personally, I think the rushing attack's a big part of it. So they fourth game of the year due to the cancellation, it ended up being the fourth game, was Kentucky. They only scored 10 points. They only ran the ball for 3.7 yards per carry in that game. They'd run it for 2.7 yards per carry against Georgia, who we now know is not a very good rush defense. So that's really concerning. They ran it for 2.7 yards per carry after Kentucky against Missouri. And since then, the rushing attack has been consistently good. Over 4 yards per carry against A&M, which is a darn good mark because that's a very good rush defense. Whatever their problems are secondary. A&M's rush defense is very good. 5.6 against Tennessee, almost 4 yards, right at 4 yards a carry against Ole Miss, but that it was a lot of carries. And then Florida, again, 4 yards per carry. It's consistent rushing production that they did not have early in the season. They've continually scored more than 20 points in these games. It's encouraging. The offense is working. I think you're probably right. If you were to look at why this happened, maybe it's the turn to AJ Turner later in the year. I don't know. They haven't been really consistent with how they used him, but I do think it's the fact that they've kind of gotten some different options down in the passing game, and that's working a lot better. It's not just Samuel. Brian Edwards and Shi Smith and Mark Way are all
Yeah,
part of the scheme now.
that was a point that I was going to make. If we're comparing this team, this offense, to the Duke team that Clemson just faced, where Duke probably has a better pro talent at quarterback. Although I think Jake Bentley is a good quarterback. He's a good college quarterback. I think South Carolina with Edwards, Samuel, and Smith have a far better, more capable wide receiver unit, especially to go up against a really physical Clemson secondary. So just agreeing with you there.
Yeah, no. So I don't know that if South Carolina has the horses, but I do think, especially offensively, they found some guys that are pretty good, and that's gonna give them the ability to sort of hold up a little more. The bigger concern for me really is it's dealing with that Clemson offense. It's dealing with that Clemson receiving core. I think the South Carolina offense is going to do their job for the most part. They're going to be able to get some plays in the perimeter that maybe some other teams weren't, but everybody's going to struggle with that front four. The problem, I think, physically with Clemson, the thing that Duke struggled with so badly is, Ross and Higgins are big physical targets at receiver, and Rodgers is an exceptionally talented guy. And I think a lot of teams just talent-wise have not been able to handle those guys.
And Clemson has shown this year that, kind of like Alabama, they're a pure, true, pick your poison type of team, because they do have, since the shift to Trevor Lawrence at quarterback, and nobody's forgetting about Etienne. He's being talked about as a Heisman candidate. He's having a phenomenal year. He's another 1,000. It's a 1,000-yard season for him. I think he's 8.5 yards per attempt. But the focus has been on Trevor Lawrence and has been on these receivers. Higgins and Ross are great. They look great against Duke as well. But it's like, once you start focusing on that, because at any given moment, with how accurate Lawrence is with the deep ball, they're going to take the top off your defense. You're so worried about that, and then boom, Etienne's got 2 carries and 40 yards in a single drive. So I think that's where an Alabama or a Michigan type defense is better equipped for that, because they don't have to sell out to stop one thing. So if it was just a high-powered rushing attack, like we saw against Kentucky. Yes, Kentucky had 24 points, but they really offensively had the production of around 13 to 17 points because they could focus on that. It takes an Alabama, Michigan, or Clemson type defense to be able to face a team with true balance and come out and not have to just completely sell out to stop one thing. And to your point about worrying about South Carolina's defense, that's where I start to worry.
Yeah, and I do think South Carolina's defense don't get me wrong, it's a good defense. The problem is Clemson's offense is extremely good. And the thing that I've watched this year, as much as all these eyes are on Lawrence, I don't think people can deal with T. Higgins. When Clemson has wanted to move the ball down the field, if they want to score, if they want a first down, they throw it to Higgins and it works. 9 times out of 10. People can't deal with him. They can't stop him. They couldn't. A&M couldn't do it. He had a long score where, Lawrence's one touchdown pass when he first came in that game, he basically went over the corner, snatched the ball away. The safety bumped into the corner, and then he just ran the rest of the way for a touchdown. And I know, my point in that game is that Lawrence, that was really he only had one first down outside that play in 5 possessions. And he did score on his first pass, and I get that, but to me, it's the story is Higgins, and that guy is not getting anywhere near enough credit nationally for how dominant he is. I think in South Carolina's favor, they're probably a better matchup than a lot of the teams Clemson's played. But you do have Horn and Roderick that are not necessarily true, but freshmen sitting out there at defensive back. They've got size. I mean, Horn and Roderick are not small guys, but they are freshmen. Nixon, Montauk are much more experienced seniors. I mean, there's skill and size on the defense, but it's not quite the same unit that it was with Sky Moore, and it's not as physical unit, I think, as it had been in the past couple of years. I don't think they quite replaced, Chris Lamons from the year prior. I do wonder a little bit how well South Carolina is going to be able to hold up.
All right, so why don't you let us into the model and see what the model thinks they'll do for holding up?
The spoiler alert is not necessarily great. So the model, we look at intermediate statistics. So what percentage allowed of opponent's production? So whatever your opponent's average offensively, what percentage of that did you allow against them? Clemson's allowed teams 51% of their opponent rushing averages. That's insane. 51%, I'm pretty darn sure is the lowest mark we've ever seen. Teams are averaging a full 4.2 yards per carry going into the game against Clemson or coming out of it. It's including the Clemson game actually in those numbers. And they only averaged 2.1 yards per carry against Clemson. Just crazy. South Carolina's run defense, like I talked about, Sky Moore has just been a huge loss. They're allowing 98% of opponent rushing averages, and that's poor. You want to be above 95%. Everybody's numbers are a little bit inflated because they play group of 5 teams, kind of cupcake games. And then on the other side, pass defense, Clemson, 78% of opponent passing averages. That's very, very good. Not necessarily quite elite. It's very hard to throw on Clemson, but it's possible. It's not really even possible to run on them. That's kind of the takeaway. South Carolina, 86% of opponent passing averages. That's actually very good. They're a really good pass defense. The problem here is that Clemson should be able to run the ball. They're expected to get almost 7 yards per carry. 6.5 yards per carry. Passing game, 6.9 yards per attempt is not really enough to be super effective. You need to have about 7.5 yards per attempt to move the ball well, throwing through the air. So South Carolina is expected to not shut down the passing game, but keep it in check. The problem is 6.5 yards per carry is more than enough to carry an offense. On the flip side, South Carolina should not be able to run the ball at all because no one has been able to. 2.3 yard per carry predicted, 6.3 yards per attempt, just like Clemson. That's getting some production, but not nearly enough. 6.7 yard per play to 4.3 yard per play edge. Based off your own history, we make a unique scoring model unique to your team and your own production. And that predicts it to be 37-16 Clemson over South Carolina.
And why don't you go ahead and kind of react to that and give us your score prediction?
So I don't think that's really wholly undue. I think based off the statistics we have on both these teams, 37-16 is quite fair. The problem with this is our model and no model can really deal with discrepancies in quality of schedule, discrepancies in terms of conference strength. My personal opinion is I think the SEC is stronger than the ACC by a good bit. The metrics we talked about show that. Now, our model to some degree takes that into account, but not nearly. If these two conferences, here's the issue. If these two conferences were hypothetically such that all the stats are right and that Miami would lose to 10 out of 14 teams, or let's say in a hypothetical sense, the second best SEC team the worst SEC team, Vanderbilt would more often than not beat any ACC team. I'm not saying that's the case. I'm just talking about how the model would react to that. It would grossly underrepresent the difference that makes on each team's statistic in their schedules. The model simply can't account for it because it doesn't really know how to, because Clemson's opponents don't play SEC teams. There's very little points of correlation. If I want to over extrapolate, for example, Texas A&M against Clemson, it would say that every SEC team would destroy any ACC team because it overcompensates for one game, and there are a lot of games are their own thing. You have good games, bad games. I think if they played again, Clemson would beat A&M by a good margin. So my caveat, I think, is 37-16 is too strong because I think the model is basically giving the ACC as much credit as the SEC. Frankly, as good as Clemson is, and they absolutely deserve their number 2 ranking, I don't think the rest of the ACC is that good. It sort of underestimates that aspect of it. I think South Carolina scores a little bit more. I'm going to go with 37-24 Clemson over South Carolina. Still a solid win. Probably a game where Clemson has to pull away late. Probably also a game that I do think this may be one of the closer games Clemson's played. Probably the closest game since that Syracuse game early in the year.
We kept coming back a little bit to being worried about the South Carolina defense. I do think that offensively they could potentially hold their own. It's still a tall task. I mean, even a good offense is going to look pedestrian or can look pedestrian against this Clemson defense. In saying that, I still think that they'll find some points, but I just don't think, and I don't even know if Alan Williams is out for the season, out for, because I know he didn't travel for Florida, he didn't play against Chattanooga, and there's not a lot of news on him, so I haven't been able to keep up with where he is. But if he's not playing for South Carolina for this defense, that's a huge step back, because that was a talent that they lost in 2017. We're coming back. So they are a little banged up. They did give up a ton of points against Florida, and that just scares me. The 35 scares me, and I can't get around that. So on the positive and negative of South Carolina, that Florida game is a microcosm of their season. And I think that it's going to show up again against Clemson. 37-20 is my score for Clemson versus South Carolina, obviously with Clemson being the winner based on the tenor of my discussion so far. I would be surprised, honestly, if the game were closer than that. If this thing's going to run away and have a big time blowout factor, I think, or if the score is high scoring, I think it definitely favors Clemson. Do you think, true or false, if South Carolina, the final score of this game, if South Carolina wins it, is under 20? True or false?
Under 20 for each team, either team?
For both teams, is 17-14 type game.
I'm going to say false. I think they're going to have a hard time keeping Clemson under 20 and under any circumstances. I think they'd have to get maybe a punt return, a kick return touchdown. That's what it's going to be from. They would need a turnover and then maybe a special teams play. A lot like how they beat North Carolina State to start last year with Deebo Samuel.
Okay, anything else on this one?
Yeah, I think first thing I'll say is it's funny after all this bluster that I ended up picking the game to be closer than you did. The second thing is I do think, I've been a little critical of Trevor Lawrence, and I know some Clemson fans have bristled at that in previous videos. I don't think my thoughts were unfounded. The past couple games, if you watched it, announcers have talked about him being a little bit off and he doesn't look quite right. He looks about like what I expect him to be, which is a very good quarterback that looks like a true freshman that's still working on his timing and chemistry with the receivers. But he's still a very, very good quarterback. It's just anytime I make comments, they always get viewed in the lens of expectations. I didn't expect him to win the Heisman Trophy his true freshman year, just like Peyton Manning didn't. He's just learning. He's barely practiced. He's going to get better. And he is, in my opinion, very rapidly improving and becoming a much better quarterback. But it's a good safety blanket, certainly, when you have that receiving core.
All right, y'all, that's going to do it for our Clemson, South Carolina preview. Remember, in the comments, let us know what your score prediction is. Give us a thumbs up if you like this video. If you love it, give us a subscribe. If you just kind of loved it, subscribe anyway. Just go ahead and do it. you're going to want to see some more content from us, I promise. South Carolina fans, let us know why we're crazy, why your team's got a chance, why you think we got it wrong. Clemson fans, if you think this game's going to be an even bigger blowout, let us know that as well. Do know that we don't hate your team. We've been pretty high on your team so far this year and last year. So, all right, y'all, thanks so much. Have a great week, and God bless.